Hi, this is Brandon from the Chinchilla Picking Podcast, where we want to educate you, entertain you, and we want everyone to make money, as Dave usually says so eloquently in our podcast episodes. This is a special report. We'll call it Break with Brandon, I guess. I don't know. You know, I mentioned in the last podcast that we had that I currently do not have a job. So you may be hearing more of these special reports as more important news hits the market every day, and I am sitting here with nothing to do. But with that being said, this morning at 8:30 a.m., the September jobs report was released. Now, investors were waiting on this report to clear up some questions about the labor market, and we were waiting on this report to clear up some questions about inflation and supply shortages and labor shortages and so on. Unfortunately, what we got was more questions rather than answers. Now, let's give this a bit of a backdrop, okay? In August, job openings in the U.S. stood at 10.1 million. New hires stood only at 6.1 million. Now, some were saying that this was because of the welfare benefits that were extended during the pandemic, and they argued that made staying at home more preferable for at least some, but it really didn't make any sense. If you were looking at this as a whole situation, if you were looking at these labor shortages and how they were affecting the entire world, in the UK, for example, the Recruitment and the Employment Confederation and the accountancy firm KPMG calculated that staffing shortages were actually the worst that they have seen since 1997. Other reports from Germany, France, and Israel were saying the same, and services sectors seem to be the worst hit. And with that being said, it seems to be that the common cause here, and it seems to be an obvious cause, is COVID-19. Now, polls in 2020 showed that around half of respondents were too afraid to go to work. And before the vaccine came out, around 55% of Americans said that they were very or somewhat scared that they would contract COVID-19 if they returned to their place of employment. Now, after the vaccine came out, this number fell to around 40%, which was a large decline of 15%, but it's still a very large percentage of American workers. Now, let's look at this and say, if even a small percentage of people who say they were too afraid to go to work actually did not return to work, this could easily be a cause of labor shortages, and I think it's fairly obvious that it at least partly is to blame. Now, we're potentially exacerbating the situation as many companies are enacting vaccine mandates, and the Biden administration is toying with the idea of a vaccine mandate. Now, whether you agree with that mandate or not doesn't make a difference here. Whether you think that the ends justify the means doesn't make a difference here, okay? What we're talking about, simply, it's not politics. I'm not being anti-Joe Biden when I say this. I'm not being conservative. I'm not being liberal or anything like that. I'm just trying to explain how I think these labor shortages are coming about. Now, back in September of 2020, last year, 24% of people said that they are definitely not going to get the vaccine. Now, by February in 2021, that number dropped to about 15%. So it's clear that people are becoming more okay with getting the vaccine, but still, mandated vaccines by employers could easily result in a permanent labor crisis. Now, say if only 3% of the I'm getting these numbers, by the way, from The Economist's weekly magazine. I'll post the sources for what I'm saying in the show notes page, just so you know. And what they said is if 3% of the population are too scared to go to work because of the virus, and let's say a further 5% will be shut out of the labor force due to the refusal to take the vaccine, more than 1 in 12 workers could disappear completely from the labor pool. Now, a lot of people compare the supply shortages and the inflation to the inflation of the 1970s. So it's worth looking back at that, really it is, and doing some comparison. I've always said in my personal life, I don't think that history repeats itself. I think that's a wrong way to look at it, because there's always different things that are happening that, cause different side effects and so on. History never really repeats itself, but there are still lessons that you can go back and learn from the history so that we're more educated when we face problems in the future and in the current day. Okay, so let's look at the 1970s and sort of the situation that evolved from the inflation and maybe the causes of that as well. In 1960, the Consumer Price Index, or you'll see it as the CPI in most news reports, the Consumer Price Index increased by less than 1%. But we had continued post-World War II government spending. As we know, once we start spending, it never really stops. It just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. So we had continued post-World War II government spending, and it was coupled with expansionary monetary policy. And this increased the CPI to over 5% by 1970. This was exacerbated greatly by the oil price hike that was enacted by the cartel OPEC in 1973, which was a punishment that was given out by the Arab states for the Americans' involvement in the Yom Kippur War. A lot of people look back at that price increase by OPEC and say that was the start of inflation, but it really wasn't. That just exacerbated it and it made it much worse. Really, we started with a CPI over 5% in 1970, so the problems were already there under the surface. They were just exacerbated by the oil shortage and by the oil price increases. And this was a supply shock, okay? Now, supply shocks only lead to general inflation if wages start to go up along with prices. And in the 1970s, you had a lot of trade unions that had a large amount of members in the United States. American trade union membership was around 25%, and you can even look at the United Kingdom. Membership there was even higher, and it was around 45% of the workforce. Now, these unions were never afraid to strike, even during the inflation crisis, and even when people were struggling to pay their bills. The number of strikes involving more than 1,000 workers hovered around 400 a year. Now, that is a number that is far greater than what we're seeing today. So we can't blame trade unions today, I don't think, for inflation, but we're just looking back at the 1970s and sort of explaining what happened there, right? So the effects of these labor shortages were large. The average rate of inflation in the United States between 1973 and 1981 was 9%. And in the UK, it was higher. It was at nearly 15%. So we have some similar situations here. We've got post-COVID-19 government spending and really post-housing crisis government spending. And inflationary monetary policy that hasn't really stopped since 2009. We've been riding the wave of quantitative easing for around 12 years now. And we started tapering back in, I think it was 2016, but we never finished the job of tapering. We never stopped the Fed bond purchasing program. Instead, we increased it after COVID-19 came about, and now here we are. And we're starting to see the effects of having not more wealth, but just more physical dollars in the United States economy. And as with anything, the US dollar or any currency, it abides by the same laws as any good or service, a supply and demand. So as supply increases, the less valuable it is. So you have more money, right? That's great, but it takes more of it to purchase goods and services as a result. We have not created more wealth. We've just created more money. And we've made it harder for those on fixed incomes and really the poor working class, for people who are paycheck to paycheck, to make ends meet. Now the question is this transitory? Is it something that we're going to get over rather quickly? It doesn't seem like it anymore. Because if you look at the September jobs report, let's go over some of the numbers here. Non-farm payrolls increased by 194,000 in September, but economists were estimating that we were going to have an increase of 500,000. Not 194,000, 500,000. So this was a huge miss. Now, the unemployment rate did drop to 4.8%, and this was better than the expected 5.1%, and certainly better than August numbers, 5.2%. But even though the unemployment rate ticked down to a pandemic low, this largely reflected the labor force shrinking by 183,000 workers, and these were likely people who just stopped looking for jobs. Now, if you dig deeper into it, leisure and hospitality, along with professional and business services and retail, those led the job creation. I think this is relatively expected, considering the fact that we are still going forward with reopening. We talked about, when I was talking about the 1970s, I talked about how general inflation, sticky inflation, usually is only caused by supply shortages when wages chase those supply shortages. Now this is happening. Despite the weak jobs total, wages increased sharply. The monthly gain of 0.6% means that we've had a year-over-year rise in wages to 4.6%. And companies are using these wage increases to try to attract more labor as they face a persistent labor shortage. And officials, Fed officials, and we're talking about these in the 1970s about how we had an expansionary monetary policy. It seems like now, whether or not our current expansionary monetary policy is going to come to an end is now being called into question, because Fed officials are now saying that they see the jobs market still well short of full employment, which would be a prerequisite for them to raise interest rates. And we're currently estimating that the first rate hike will likely come around November of next year. And now we were thinking we might start tapering in November of this year, but if the Fed's looking at the unemployment rate and people not getting jobs, and they're using that as a driver as to whether or not they're going to make this decision to taper in November or not, we may just kick the ball down the road. So that's all I have for you today. That's my thoughts on this jobs report, and I wanted to give you a little bit of history as well. I hope that this has been educational. I didn't really go into any stock pick. I will have more on that on Tuesday. So you have a great day. Have a great weekend. Hey, I might see you before Tuesday. I don't know. I might be too bored to resist the temptation to do another short show here. So have a great night.